Well, again, it's so good to see you all this morning, be in worship together. And today I want to begin by talking about the prophetic imagination, the prophetic imagination. It's really kind of a scholarly term that some scholars use when they talk about the role of the prophets. And imagination, we tend to think of imagination as something that's not real. But that's not what the word means at all in this context. But it has to do with with the image that the prophets project to the people. Sometimes to provide comfort, sometimes to provide challenge. To comfort the afflicted, as they say sometimes, and afflict the comfortable at other times. To comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. That's the role of the prophets. Prophecy and the prophets, one of the most misunderstood, I think, things in Christian theology, because I think the way we tend to use the word prophet is as a fortune teller or a soothsayer. When in fact prophets really are truth sayers, not soothsayers. It's not predicting the future, but it's much more than that. The prophets are speaking a word from God in their situation, whatever is going on in their situation, in the situation of the people that they're sent to speak to. They are speaking to that situation. And it does involve both the present and the future, because they are talking about the present and what's going on in the present, and they're talking about the consequences of that in the future. Or they're talking about the difficulties in the present and the hope for the future. So present and future are certainly bound up together. So for example, a prophet might say to the people, if you continue relating to one another in the way you're relating to one another now, then there will be a dissolution of community, and things will fall apart, and it will not be good for you. But they're speaking that to affect both the present and the future, to change the hearts and minds of people in the present so that the future will have a different kind of outcome. And so that's the role of the prophet, to comfort the afflicted, to afflict the comfort. And so the prophetic imagination. So the prophets have visions and they dream dreams and they paint pictures. And imagination is a powerful thing. And if you think about it, just in everyday terms, imagination is powerful. Every great thing that happens, everything that's invented, things that make life better for people, all begin with imagination, if you think about it, with an image, with an idea. And then that image begins to take shape, and it's that image that brings into reality something different. And that's the prophetic imagination. So for example, Ezekiel, the prophet, is speaking to his people, bringing them a word of hope because they see themselves as dead. The nation is dead. The people are dead. There's no hope. There's no life in it. And so the word of the Lord comes to him. He has a vision. He's taken to a valley, a vast valley that's full of dry bones, and they are dry. They're bleached white in the sun. As far as the eye can see, a valley of dry bones. And the word of the Lord comes to him and says, "Can these bones live, O mortal?" And anyone would answer, seeing that, well, no, of course not. They're completely dead. They're bleached white by the sun. But Ezekiel's response in this vision is, "You know, Lord. You know the answer to that question." And so the word of the Lord comes to him and says, "Prophesy to these bones." And he does. And the bones begin rattling. It's kind of an eerie image, really. They begin rattling and coming together, bone to bone. And then there's muscle and sinew and flesh. And suddenly they have flesh on them. But they're not living. And so he says, "Call on the winds," and the winds come forth. Wind, breath, spirit, all the same word in Hebrew. And so the Spirit animates them, and they come to life, and they're alive. The prophetic imagination, it is an image that the people needed to hear to know there's hope. You may think you're completely dead. You may think there's no hope, but the Spirit of God will give you life. And that's the image, the prophetic imagination. Think about Jeremiah. Word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah, go down to the potter's house and watch the potter at work. And so Jeremiah goes. He watches the potter at work at the wheel and notices how the potter is with strong and careful and skilled hands shaping the clay. And then suddenly the potter stops the wheel and the vessel on the wheel just sort of sags. You can imagine that. And he thinks, well, it's just ruined. And the potter pulls out a little imperfection in the clay and throws it on the discard pile and begins to work the clay again, and it's now stronger and will be beautiful and useful. And suddenly there's that prophetic imagination, that image that, yes, that's like us. We're like clay in God's hands being shaped and molded, and God removes the imperfections and makes us stronger in the process and useful. The prophetic imagination. You think about Isaiah bringing a word of comfort to his afflicted people. The kingdom of David is dead. It's gone. The great Davidic kingdom, the united monarchy, has come to an end. The great oak, the mighty oak of David, is now just a stump. It's dead. But the prophetic imagination sees that stump and says, there is a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Jesse is David's father. The stump of Jesse. There's a shoot. Hope. New life. Powerful image. And all these images shape and mold how the people are dealing with the present as they move into the future with hope. And they're speaking to the situation in which the people find themselves. So what is the situation in which Amos finds himself? Amos would not call himself a prophet. In fact, in our text a moment ago, you heard him say, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. There's a sort of class of professional prophets, and he's not part of that class. I'm not a prophet. And I'm not the son of a prophet. That's not our family business, he's saying in essence. Rather, I'm a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. That's what I do. I'm a farmer. But God called me to go to Israel, to the northern kingdom, and to prophesy there. And so that's what Amos does. What's going on in the northern kingdom? Well, they're at peace at the moment. They're not at war. Prosperity's good. Houses of worship, places of worship, full. People are worshiping. They're celebrating the feast and the festivals and all of that. But there is this growing gap between rich and poor in the land. There are people who have built magnificent houses for themselves, but are not generous toward their brothers and sisters in need. There are those who, by all appearances, are very righteous, but they have fallen into a kind of satisfied self-righteousness. They don't care about their brother and sister. They don't care about others. And so he's afflicting the comfortable as he looks across the landscape of his context. So what's going on in our context? We need that prophetic imagination to pay attention to our own context. What's happening? What's life like in our community, in our state, in our nation, in our world? What's going on? What does it say to us? And more importantly, what does God have to say about that? Did you see the headline in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram today? It said that there are people living in 1.4 million families in the state of Texas who are hungry. 1.4 million families in the state of Texas who are hungry, who don't have food security. In Tarrant County, 26% of the children in Tarrant County are hungry. We ought to pay attention to that. In fact, the article is not only calling attention to that, but it's talking about the way nonprofits, religious organizations, others are stepping up to meet that challenge. How do you think that began? It began with this prophetic imagination, the ability to see a vision for something different. That's the way it works. We look around us in our community, in our state, our nation, our world, and we bring to it the words of the prophets and the words of Jesus to that, calling us to see something different. So what's Amos' prophetic imagination? Well, Amos has 3 visions that he sees. The first one, terrifying vision of locusts destroying everything, destroying all the crops. Famine is sure to follow. It's a terrifying vision. And he says, "Oh Lord, Jacob is small, and that is so great, he cannot survive it." Now, Jacob, of course, is Israel's first name before he gets a name change to Israel. And so by that, it means the kingdom of Israel. It's too small. It can't withstand that. "Forgive, O Lord," he says. And the Lord said, "That will not come to pass." The second vision he has is of a consuming fire that even consumes the oceans and begins to eat the land. And he says, "It's too great. Jacob is too small, cannot endure that. Forgive, O Lord." And the Lord said, "That will not come to pass." But then he has another vision, and it is a vision of a wall built with a plumb line, and the Lord is standing by the wall with a plumb line, and the word of the Lord comes to him and says, "Amos, what do you see?" And he says, "I see a plumb line." And the word of the Lord says, "Behold, I am standing in the midst of the people with a plumb line." Now I happen to have with me a plumb line. Carry it with me all the time. First time I saw a plumb line was Mr. Albert Fawcett. Albert and Naomi Fawcett were friends of my grandmother. They'd been friends with my grandparents. My grandfather had died. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and Mr. and Mrs. Fawcett would visit my grandmother, and Mrs. Fawcett would go inside, and my grandmother would visit with her, and Mr. Fawcett would always sit with me on the front porch. I visited my grandmother a lot, and I loved talking to him. He had great stories. Old carpenter. I say old. Who knows? He was probably 58 or 9 at that time. But he had these old tools that would certainly be antiques now. They were practically antiques then, and I loved those tools. And he would show me how to use them, and I still love tools. You can ask my family. If they need a tool, I probably have it, and I probably have 2 of them. Because I love that. And it began with Mr. Fawcett, and he would let me play with these great old tools like a brace and bit, much better than just a drill. I mean, it was just fascinated with that, and a chalk line, and he would let me snap it and make lines with the chalk line on the sidewalk, and tell me how all these tools work. And he pulled this one out, and he said, "You know what that is?" And I said, "No." I mean, in my imagination, I thought maybe, a hypnotic thing, hypnotized. I didn't know. He said, "It's a plumb line." And he said, the thing on the end is called a plumb bob. And he said, "You notice how it hangs straight down?" And he said, "The thing about a plumb line is it always hangs straight down. And so you can tell if a wall or a post is completely upright, completely vertical. And you can test it with a plumb line." And he said it's one of the oldest tools there is. It goes back hundreds of years, he said. And the fact is, it goes back thousands of years, to the early Egyptian period at least. The plumb line. He said it's always vertical, no matter what. It's the standard for what is upright. Fence post, wall, anything, you can measure it with the plumb line. So that's the image of Amos. In the midst of the people is a plumb line. Now Amos, in afflicting the comfortable, would go into a place of worship, and he would speak on behalf of the Lord, and he would say, this is amazing, because the Lord commanded the festivals and the feasts, but he would say, "I hate your festivals and feasts. But let justice roll down like waters, mighty waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Justice and righteousness. See, that's what's symbolized by the plumb line. Set in the midst of the people, this is the standard of justice and righteousness. That's the prophetic imagination. That's the image he has. Those two words are the most important words for the prophets, justice and righteousness. Justice has to do with the way we live together. It has to do with the way we treat those who have no voice, those who are on the margins. It has to do with the way we order our world and our society to make life better for everybody. And righteousness has perhaps more to do with how we individually make decisions that make life better. Righteousness has to do with being honest and having integrity and loving and caring and serving and being strong in our faith. Righteousness, justice and righteousness. So the challenging question is, what is your plumb line? What's my plumb line? We all have a standard. We have to have a standard. We have a National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's an international organization, and it sets the standards for how long is a meter, or how much is a kilogram. And there is a standard by which all others are measured. We're talking today about the standard of righteousness and of justice. And that one standard is important because if you've ever cut firewood, I learned this as a child from my uncles and my dad. You can't measure the next stick of firewood by the last stick of firewood you cut. You know what I mean? You need to have a length. You cut that length. This is how long I want the firewood to be. And then that becomes your standard, and you cut all the pieces of firewood to match that standard, because what happens, if you use the last log that you cut to cut the next one, then they'll get shorter and shorter, or they'll be of varied lengths, and it just never works out. You need a standard, see? And so our standard as Christians is Jesus. Jesus is our plumb line, standing in the midst of community. The risen Christ is with us, we say. Jesus is our plumb line. And when Jesus talked about justice and righteousness, he defined his mission according to justice. This plumb line of justice. He preached in the little synagogue in Nazareth. He started out his ministry there according to the Gospel of Luke, and he read from the prophet Isaiah, and he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." That's his mission. He called everyone to be concerned about justice and righteousness so that we welcome the stranger. We give food to the hungry, clothing to the naked, water for the thirsty. We visit those who are in prison and those who are ill, and we offer comfort because Jesus set the standard for that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus set the standard. He's our plumb line. He even said, in what must have shocked everyone, as he defined righteousness, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. And nobody was more righteous than the Pharisees, and nobody knew it more than the Pharisees. They'd fallen into a kind of self-righteousness, self-importance, and they became so enamored with all the little details of the law and making laws that interpreted the laws, 640 of them, or so, as it finally turns out, that they lost sight of the big picture, of the weightier matters of the law, Jesus said. So that, for example, he jabbed them, he made fun of them with this. He said, the Pharisees carried around little cheesecloth filters. They poured their wine through that before they would drink it. Why? Because if there happened to be a gnat in there, gnats are not kosher. They're unclean. You're not supposed to eat a gnat. Did you know that? You've learned something today. Gnats are unclean. And you're not supposed to eat camels either. Camels are unclean, as it turns out. And so he said to those Pharisees, you strain out a gnat and yet you swallow a camel. You're so concerned about the little things that you miss the big things. So concerned about that you miss the loving grace of God that welcomes people. And so you reject those who don't live up to your standards. That's what they were doing. Your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees, and Jesus is our plumb line. So the thing about plumb bobs is they're often really beautiful. This one is polished brass. And, it's kind of simple, but it's pretty. Some plumb bobs are really ornate and magnificent. In fact, there is an international plumb bob collectors association. There really is. And you can go on their website and see these amazing works of art that are plumb bobs. And it's easy when you see all of those magnificent works of art to get so caught up in the beauty of the things that you forget these are tools. And I was thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about the beautiful Bibles that we have and the family Bibles that can be really ornate and they sit on the table. The Book of Kells, beautifully illustrated that we saw, the illuminated manuscripts that we saw in Ireland on the choir tour. Magnificent. We can get so caught up in that we forget, wait a minute, there's a message here. This is kind of a tool for learning about righteousness and justice and putting those into practice in our lives. Our buildings, our church buildings, magnificent, beautiful. And we can get so caught up in that we forget that, wait a minute, these are tools to enable our worship, to enable our fellowship, to enable us to challenge one another and to go from this place as God's people in the world with our standard guiding us in what we do. So it's my prayer for you and for me as we go from this place, that we would go asking ourselves the question, really, what is my plumb line? What's my standard as I seek to be God's person in the world?